This week, we're diving into data. In their annual security survey, Forrester Research asked 3,000 respondents if they've suffered a security breach in the last 12 months. More than 68% said yes. Now, mathematically, that figure isn't surprising, at least to me. 68% is the common one standard deviation on a classic bell curve. Bell curves aside, David, did that statistic surprise you?
Not really. Data security is a tough thing to do and tough to do well. And if you think about it, companies have been gathering data for so long. They have so much data. Maybe they don't even know what they have or what kind of data that they have. Of course, there are going to be attacks. Of course, there are going to be losses of that data.
And I think, too, when you think about a data breach, could be anything from an insider attack or even an inadvertent insider leak or a database misconfiguration or, someone left the good old floppy drive on the subway.
Floppy drive, Pam?
Well, yes.
Yeah,
USB,
you're right.
floppy drive, all kinds of, all the ways that we store data, even, the box of paperwork that was left in the car and the car got stolen. So, it could be anything when we think about what breach regulations are now in terms of disclosure policies and all the new things that we're seeing in the market.
Exactly. Data is pervasive, and this is a tough challenge. But I think there's some things that companies can do to protect themselves and to have a little better hygiene overall, right? That idea of a security fundamental, it all starts with data and how you think about it.
That's exactly why in this episode, we're going to dive deeper into how data protection, including a strategy around encryption, can help you in the face of a security breach. This is the Security Intelligence Podcast, where we discuss cybersecurity, industry analysis, tips, and success stories. I'm Pam Cobb.
And I'm David Moulton. This episode, we spoke with Stephanie Belarus, Research Director for the Security and Risk Team at Forrester Research. Stephanie explained why organizations have no excuse to start implementing a data protection strategy and can benefit from a holistic approach to encryption. Here's our conversation.
So, Stephanie, welcome. Thank you for joining us as a guest. Can you introduce yourself and share a bit about your role?
Sure, and thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this. So my name is Stephanie Belarus. I'm the Research Director for the Security and Risk Team at Forrester Research. So I manage the team. I set the research agenda. I work with all the analysts who cover everything from enterprise risk management all the way through to cybersecurity.
How important is encryption given today's data breaches and threat landscape?
Yeah, it's become more important than ever. Every year, my team and I, we do an analysis of the largest breaches and privacy abuses of the previous year. And what we always find is that the extent of the breach or the impact of the breach could have drastically been limited if the data in question had been encrypted. And in some cases as well, if your data had been encrypted, you don't necessarily have to report it under certain breach notification requirements, whether it's here in the United States or even under GDPR in the EU. If the data had been encrypted and that there's a limited chance that any kind of customer data had been exposed because there's no way for a cyber criminal to actually monetize or use that data maliciously, then you don't actually have to report it. It also helps to reduce both security and privacy concerns if you're hosting data with a third party, especially if you're maintaining the keys. This way, whether it was a malicious insider at a third party or whether it was, an unfriendly government or a foreign government that wanted to access the data, they actually wouldn't be able to access the data if it was encrypted and you had control of the keys, because otherwise they would have to gain control of the keys from you. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the problem as well, in our annual security survey, we asked 3,000 respondents whether they had suffered a breach in the last 12 months, and more than 68% said yes. And that's just the ones that know that they currently have a breach. For those that don't know have a breach, we actually think that the percentage is even higher than that.
So given all these breaches and, the 68%, which even knowing and suspecting that's underreported, how has user perception of encryption changed over time?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It hasn't changed. The good news, so according to that same survey that I had referenced, is you'll find that security teams have adopted every form of encryption that's available. Full disk encryption, database encryption, cloud encryption, you name it. They say that they have it somewhere in the enterprise. But when you work closely with clients, doing advisory or consulting or just, interviewing them for research, what you'll find is it's actually really not pervasive throughout the entire environment. You'll find pockets of it. So we'll typically find that full disk encryption has become pretty pervasive on laptops because that's sort of a no-brainer given how many laptops are lost or stolen every year. And maybe you'll find some pretty savvy business owners or application owners who actually have adopted database encryption to protect specific fields within a database that might have customer data in it. But not enough enterprises are actually taking a holistic approach where they really step back and look at their environment and they inventory their environment and they classify customer data throughout the environment and they ensure that everything that is the most sensitive is really encrypted in every system of record and even throughout all of their file systems. And the unfortunate thing is that there's still perceptions that encryption is complicated, that it's processing intensive, that the key management can be very, very difficult. And these are conversations that normally I would have had 10 years ago, but I'm still having them today, and I'm educating security professionals about how much encryption has changed. So, yeah, it's kind of mixed there, unfortunately.
So you've talked about key management and some of the problems and just trying to get a hold on encryption practices. Are those really the biggest challenges, or are there other business practices that are keeping people from adopting encryption as a standard?
One of the biggest challenges is just sort of the inertia against getting started. I'll hear from clients quite a bit that they feel daunted by the amount of data they actually have in their environment. So they don't know where to start. So imagine you're a very large enterprise. You're, Global 2000. You have petabytes of information, both structured and unstructured. And so, when someone like me gives you advice that the first thing to do is to inventory and classify that information, it just seems like an incredible mountain to climb when you have petabytes of information. So what happens is they'll use that as an excuse to never actually start in the first place because they just think it's impossible. But in reality, you just need to start small and continue. You don't need to try to inventory and classify all of your information at once. I've had one client who was a global construction firm that operated in 53 countries globally. They took a country-by-country approach. I've seen others take a line of business unit approach where they go business unit by business unit. Or they might actually start by focusing on their most important applications and their most important business processes. So that's one of the biggest challenges, just the excuse to not get started and getting over that hurdle. And maybe you choose that you're not going to go back and start trying to encrypt all of your historical information, but you want to pick a point in time where going forward, you're going to start. That's another approach as well. The other thing I would say is you want to keep your classifications simple. I've seen enterprises come up with as many as 10 classifications. Again, you're overcomplicating things. I think 3 levels, 4 levels maximum, something like public, internal, and confidential. And anything that's highly regulated, so for example, something that's considered personally identifiable information under GDPR, under the California Consumer Privacy Act, or under HIPAA or PCI, that information plus anything that you consider your most sensitive intellectual property, the information that really makes you different or provides a competitive advantage, your trade secrets, your designs, your code, also anything that lays out strategy or potential M&A targets, that's the information that you put into that top level category as confidential, and that's where you want to focus on applying encryption. So, to me, if you keep it simple, you start small and you scale, you keep your classification simple, that'll really get over a lot of the challenges.
What are some of the key use cases you're seeing in the market for encryption today?
Yeah, so some of what I mentioned before, protecting customer data, a lot of it does have to do with compliance, but I think the savviest companies are doing it because they know consumers actually care about privacy. That's sort of a misperception, I think, in the market today that consumers don't care about privacy. We've actually seen the opposite, which is as a result of all these breaches, as a result of all this high-profile news of, big companies really abusing their data, consumers are getting very, very privacy savvy. And I think the savvy companies are onto that, and they're using encryption to protect data, not just from cyber criminals, but even from internal privacy abuses.